Well, good afternoon to the RIPA board members who are present and to the members of the public and to the Department of Justice staff. This is our policy subcommittee meeting of the RIPA board, and the DOJ was kind enough to send us an agenda, and at the top of that agenda is introductions. And so if board members could pop it one to the other just to introduce yourself, that would be great. My name is Andrea Guerrero. I'm the Executive Director at Alliance San Diego and the chair of this committee. And I will pop it to Amar.
Hi everybody, this is Amar Campa-Najjar. I'm from San Diego and I am excited to be co-chairing this hopefully after the vote. And I will kick it off to Lily.
Thank you, Amar. I'm Lily Kajavi. I'm a professor of mathematics at Loyola Marymount University in Los Angeles. Pleased to be part of the policy subcommittee. I'll pop it off to Melanie.
Melanie Ochoa. I'm with ACLU Southern California, and I'll pop it to Manju.
Hi everyone, Manju Kulkarni. I'm Executive Director of APCON, the Asian Pacific Policy and Planning Council in Los Angeles, and co-founder of Stop AAPI Hate, and so privileged to be with you all.
Wonderful. I think that is all of the board members who are present. Have we missed any board members? All right, then let's proceed to the second item, which is approval of the August 19th, 2021 subcommittee minutes. We'll give board members a few minutes to review those, and if when anybody's ready to make a motion, I welcome that.
I will move to accept the minutes.
I second.
Wonderful. All approving of the minutes of the motion? I see a hand from...
Aye.
Yes, I see. Wonderful. If we could get a verbal aye from everyone, that would be great.
Aye. From Commissioner Kulkarni.
Wonderful. Okay. Minutes are approved. We'll move on to the third item, which is the election of a subcommittee co-chair. I would like to nominate Amar Campa-Najjar as the subcommittee co-chair. He's new to the board, but is a longtime student and concerned community member, interested in a student of issues of equity, as we all are, and I think he would be well to be subcommittee chair. We welcome other nominations, of course, as well. And so, yeah, are there any other nominations for subcommittee chair? No. Okay. Well, then I move to nominate Amar Campa-Najjar as subcommittee chair. Can I get a second for that?
Second. I think that's great. Thank you, Amar.
Wonderful. And let's take a vote on that. If we could get a verbal vote, that would be great.
From Melanie Ochoa.
Aye from Manju Kulkarni.
Wonderful.
Aye from Lily Kajavi.
And I'm an aye as well. Amar, would you like to vote?
Yes, I as well.
Okay, wonderful. Well, welcome, Amar. You are now the official co-chair of this subcommittee, and we thank you for stepping up to fulfill this role, this service.
Thank you. It's an honor.
So wonderful. So Amar, what I propose to go forward then is for me to lead the discussion of the proposed report contents, for you to facilitate the public comment, and then kick it back to me for any votes that are needed. And then we hope to move swiftly through this agenda and give people back time in their day at the end of this meeting.
Great.
Wonderful. Okay, well, let's proceed with a discussion of the proposed report contents. I know that there is an order here for the proposed contents, and I would like to reorder them to align with the order in the report, if that's okay with everyone. So that would mean that we would discuss transgender or the gender analysis, followed by the disability analysis, the consent and supervision stops and searches, pretext stops, ending with accountability systems. I think that just might make it easier for us who are tracking on the report itself to move through it. Any objections to that? Okay. Department of Justice, would you like to brief us or provide us highlights on the gender analysis, which is at the top of our list?
I sure would. Thank you for that invitation, and Co-Chair Guerrero. The board and the subcommittee have reviewed previous versions of this section of the report and provided input. This section begins on page 1 of the meeting materials and begins with an introduction and contextual information, followed by data analysis, best practice recommendations, and a summary of relevant legislation. Those best practices recommendations can be found on pages 19 through 26 and are grouped thematically into 12 areas. Data analysis, community-based accountability, non-vehicle stops, quality of life offenses, training, non-discrimination based on gender identity and sexual orientation, respectful communication and agencies forms, search procedures, transportation, sexual misconduct, appearance-related items, and civilian complaint procedures. I'm very interested in any comments that the subcommittee would like to discuss regarding how the data is presented in the section, if that's clear, if there is anything that would be helpful. Also regarding the potential best practices recommendations that you've reviewed, and anything additional that you would like to take to the board. And I'm glad to answer any questions.
Wonderful. Thank you, Anna. I'll just kick us off. I said this at the full board meeting recently. It's a really well written, well researched, well thought out section. And so I applaud you and your colleagues for the work that you did to put it together. I want to open it up to board members for suggestions, comments, thoughts.
I can jump in.
Oh, go ahead.
First of all, I'll just make this comment as to the report as a whole, or the sections that we reviewed as a whole. I think it's really great. I love it's so well written in terms of the data presented. It's not just the RIPA data, but it's also looking at data from other jurisdictions. And other jurisdictions, specific jurisdictions within California in terms of policies, how they've been implemented. It's also lands on, as a result, some very strong recommendations. And I think that they're all very defensible, and I hope that they're very actionable as well. So I hope that this becomes like the next step to jurisdictions or statewide implementing a lot of the changes that are being proposed here. I think that the data is very well done, very well presented. And in particular with the section on the gender data, I really appreciated the call outs and the narrative discussion. And I think I mentioned this at the other board meeting, the full board meeting. I don't remember if that was present in other reports, but I feel like it was so impactful in this one, and that really stood out to me. And I thought it was very great to illustrate the kind of how these issues are felt by people on the streets, which is what is missing from just the data analysis, right? It's kind of almost a law enforcement perspective. It's just how they perceive people, what the actions they're taking at people. And this is kind of how that, what they would probably perceive as like a trivial stop, how that actually leads to a host of consequences for the individual stop, including how they view themselves. So I think that's tremendously important data to be including in here, even though it's kind of outside of what just the numbers can tell us. So thank you for everything that's here. And so I had a few kind of questions and comments. One was on the note on gender data and the CHP analysis. I know that there's going to be a previous note, and I don't know if I just missed the note because I know it's just references like XX. But if I was curious if this error in the data reporting was just like a technical error, or if it was actually something related to how the agency was policing people or treating people or identifying people, because that might have a bigger impact than just like there was some coding error where something was ends up being miscoded kind of technically. And I think I hope that will be discussed if it is more than just a technical error. And I don't know if you wanted to talk. I had some other questions and comments too, but I don't know if you wanted to talk about that at all.
Thank you for noting that. I will invite our partners from CGIS if they want to provide some further explanation. The note, there is a greater explanation in the draft report in the version that we've shared for the Stop Data Subcommittee tomorrow, but I realize that hasn't been shared with you. So are there any team members from CGIS that would like to discuss? Thanks, Kevin.
Yeah, this is Kevin in the Research Center. And I also invite Arwen if she has anything to add after I've said my bit here about this issue. But yeah, as Anna pointed out, this is like a brief rundown of that issue, and then it makes reference back to another call out that we have in the section for the stop data analysis that's a bit more in depth about this. But what it boils down to is this was a technical issue in CHP's system software that they use to translate the data from the format that they store their data in to the JSON file that they transmit their data to the Department of Justice with. And it introduced an error that specifically affected cases for individuals whom officers indicated perceiving as transgender. And so that is why this note is placed in this section of the report, a callback, because obviously this section has a lot to do with individuals that officers perceived be transgender, and so we wanted to be upfront with that this year's worth of data, as well as some previous data, had some errors introduced through that technical data translation software. And so in order to avoid any of the issues with viewing data by having only data from cisgender individuals or individuals perceived as gender nonconforming from CHP, we excluded them from these analyses in that section, just the gender sections and just this first section that we'll be talking about today, in order to avoid any issues there with there not being enough variance in CHP's data as far as the gender of the stopped individuals. So I don't know if Arwen, if you have anything to add to that as well from the business perspective and dealing directly with the agencies.
Hi, Kevin, thank you. No, I don't have anything to add. I think you summed it up pretty well.
Can I ask a little bit more about this, because this is one of the questions I had as well. So I know the Stop Data Committee, and maybe tomorrow at that subcommittee meeting we'll be talking about this too, had some additional pages from the report. And as you said, Kevin, it describes that there was I'm going to call it an encoding error. But what wasn't clear to me from the explanation of the report, it said that there are over 1,000 cases that this affected, 1,000 records. And even though out of all stops statewide, that's a very tiny fraction, if it was consistently all stops where an officer perceived, let's say the driver as transgender, then it's actually, it seems like it's a large number of those stops. And so I guess what I was wondering is, the correction was, or the error was caught maybe after some data submission period, but was there an effort to go back and try to to recode. In other words, if it's just a data encoding error, but you can still extract meaningful information from the overall stop record, what's the status of that, or what decisions were made about that?
Yeah, no, that's a good point. So yes, of course, 1,000. I think it's 1,100 if I recall correctly.
Yeah, it says here it says over 1,000.
Okay, yeah.
So I took that to be on the order around 1,000. Okay.
Yeah, it's around that amount of records, and it was the entire amount of records for transgender individuals in CHP's data stop for 2020. And so the point in time when we discovered this issue, we had discovered an issue prior to this with some data, a very similar issue introduced into the data that affected records for gender nonconforming individuals, which is actually at the end of the September meeting, what the message was there. At the regulations full board meeting, there was like a note about, hey, the department has discovered an error in the data. We're in the process of correcting it. That was that error that Research Center encountered when they're going through and performing some of these analyses. So at that point in time, worked with CHP to correct the data in the system for them to basically retransmit those records with the error fixed so that we could include them in our analyses. And then we reran the analyses after that point in time. And by the time that we reran the analyses, then we discovered this other error that wasn't as apparent before when we didn't have the gender nonconforming records. And so at the point in time when we discovered this error with the lead up to the statutorily mandated reporting time period of by January 1, it would be very difficult for us to go back and incorporate these 1,100 records in all of the analyses, not just in this section, but in the other sections throughout the report. It would basically require a full rerun of all of the analyses that we've done to date. So it would be difficult for us to go back and do at this point, given that the statute mandates that we have this report complete and published by January 1. So I know that the information exists at CHP and that they actually have transmitted some of that information back to the department, but it's a multi-week process to then create, because the stock data collection system is not designed to allow agencies to change records after the cutoff period of April 1 that's outlined in statute. And so this would require a change to an existing process and for a multi-week process to actually incorporate the data, which would put us towards when you all are supposed to be voting on the report for us to just have the data updated in the system, that we'd have to then go back and re-extract everything out to rerun the analyses. So realistically, with you all needing to vote by December 1, we couldn't integrate those records and then reanalyze everything.
So I guess it still does raise the question, are there some issues of interest where having those 1,000+ records really would be informative? I mean, CHP is it's basically the largest the agency, law enforcement agency in the state that's making stops. And so this isn't a question of a new, smaller city coming on in a later wave of data collection, and then now they're going to be pushed a year behind, let's say, in data collection. So and I appreciate what you're saying about the practicality and the timing and the importance of shining a light on the report as a whole, and not, somehow stymieing that because of this one much smaller subset. But still, it raises the question to me: are there some narrower questions in the report? Maybe just looking at the trans community and interactions with the police, where we want to go back and look at that data set. And so what I didn't quite hear was, is there a viable way to look at those records, maybe even separately? Maybe it's on a different timeline. So maybe there's something for the board to think about. And when we talk about next steps at the end of the meeting.
Yes.
I know we have other issues we want to move on to.
Yes, that sounds great.
Okay.
I'm going to put that. I have a running list of things to think about for future reports, which could include interim reports, and also for action steps.
Okay. Thank you.
So,
and thanks,
yes.
Kevin, for clarifying.
Yeah, thank you.
Any other comments?
Yeah, I'll just go on that. So one thing then on that note then, given that because I know that even like I had raised before that agencies were kind of systematically misgendering folks. And that was the first thing that, without having the context of that other footnote in this conversation that we just had, that was actually my first interpretation of this footnote, which is more meaningful in terms of how individuals might be policed also. So I would just add something in there that the systematic error that could not necessarily mean technical, but kind of what you referenced here, that just a little more like encoding error or data transmission error or something to make it clear that it's not misgendering that's driving that. And then two more points. On when you talk about, so there's one of the, I don't have page numbers on mine, I'm sorry, because I printed it out and I don't think it had page numbers on the document, but when we're talking about sexual misconduct recommendations, so I don't know what page that's on. First, it says the RIPA board recommends that agencies adopt policies that, and I want to say I like that language. That I think a lot of the language gets a lot more hedged. So I want to like, in other places to where we say like agencies could consider perhaps adopting, like where we can change that to the language that we use here, which is agencies recommend that agencies adopt. But the policy that clearly and completely prohibit any on-duty sexual activity, that may need to be defined or have some kind of definition. I know at least in like SB 1421, which is a bill that allows disclosure of certain police officer records, sexual assault includes to mean the commission or attempted initiation of any sexual act or offer of leniency or favors under the color of authority. So like propositioning someone for sex is also a sexual act. So I don't know, just to be clear that broad definition should apply. And there could be other sources that you have a definition from some other policies, but I think just defining sexual activity as not just being actual sex acts, which I don't think is probably intended. The section that's vision for future reports, one suggestion that I had there is if SB 357 is not signed, continuing to do follow-ups on stop data for some of the provisions that are encompassed in that bill, to continue tracking the disparate application or enforcement of those types of laws on sex work. Yeah, just a few more. One, I think this is still in the same section. Oh, this actually might be disability. So I'll hold on to that. I think this is disability section. So those are my comments for that piece. Thank you very much.
Board Member Manju Kulkarni, do you have anything that you wanted to add?
Yes, I had a question about looking at together the factors of race as well as gender when it comes to those in the transgender community. If that, I apologize if I missed it, but what opportunities there are to look at those factors together, and obviously the issues around intersectionality that they raise in terms of jobs.
I welcome you to join this response, Kevin, since you're working closely with the data. The subcommittee early in the year did a preliminary review of 2019 data by gender and race, only in some of the analyses, not as developed as you see the section now. And do you want to talk about that a bit, Kevin? I see you're here.
I was going to bring up the prior year's report where there were a couple sections that one section that specifically looked at the intersection between race and gender for a few measures that we were looking at last year, as well as there were some sections that looked at race and age, and I believe that race and disability type as well. And so kind of how the board arrived at some of the sections that are outlined in the policies section of this year's report, they kind of sprouted from that initial work that we did in the board's past year report that did some examinations of the data looking at outcomes by both race and gender. Not quite as many as are included in this year's report, but they were replicated across multiple different identity groups, whereas this year's report is a bit more focused on gender, and therefore includes a bit more in-depth dive into examinations of different outcomes by gender. But last year's report did include some of that, but there's absolutely room moving forward in the future to delve deeper in if there are ideas that board members have of things that they'd specifically like to see analyzed, looking at both gender and race.
Yes, and so that could be something that we include in vision for future reports. I think that is of interest. Intersectional data analysis is of interest, and there's not enough time to crunch that now. And but Board Member Kulkarni, would you be interested in adding that to a vision for future reports?
Yes, definitely.
Okay, great. Okay. Anything else on this section before we move on? Okay. Well, let's keep moving. We've got a lot to get through. All right. Let's turn to disability policy section. And DOJ, if you have anything you want to highlight for us, we welcome hearing that.
Hi, good afternoon. So I'll be taking us through disability as well as the consent, probation, and the pretext stops. In going through this today, I really want the board to keep in mind that we're kind of reaching the final phases of this report. And so really looking at ways where we can strengthen our language or improve those recommendations that are ultimately going to come out of this report. And so to that extent, if we focus our time on that, it would be wonderful. But of course, moving forward, that vision for future reports is important. Last time we did not get to touch on the disability section of the report. So really thankful we're having this additional meeting. It's on pages 29 through 54 of your meeting packet, if you're kind of scrolling through the packet. In our rerun of the data, we found some sad and shocking statistics. Those with disabilities, and particularly mental health disabilities, were stopped 4.8 times more likely to have been searched, and those perceived to have other types of disabilities were 2.7 times more likely to be searched. But being searched is only a very small sliver of the experience those with disabilities experience when interacting with the police. So this year we also looked at use of force in interactions with those perceived to have disabilities. In that analysis, we found officers were 5.2 times more likely to use force against those perceived to have a mental health disability, and 3.3 times more likely to use force against individuals perceived to have other disabilities. We also took a look at the community caretaking data, and this is outlined in the report as well. Those with mental health disabilities were stopped for community caretaking at exponentially higher rates than those perceived not to have disabilities. Sadly, what we also saw in the data was, despite these community caretaking stops not being related to criminal activity, officers not only were stopping these individuals and searching them, they were also 5 times more likely to use force against those perceived to have a mental health disability. So out of those statistics and some of the research we've been doing this year, we have started to lay out some best practices recommendations. And those best practices recommendations begin on page 48. And so there's a number of different ones laid out. I'm not going to be able to read through them all, but I did want to highlight a few topic areas. And so one of those is regarding use of force and policies that address both the ADA and how that intertwines with the use of force. We also have put recommendations for using the least police involved response, or instead prioritizing a community-based response to someone, for example, experiencing a mental health crisis. And then there are some more specific recommendations to policing tactics. For example, there are recommendations about eliminating the practice of sweeps and instead prioritizing housing first. There are also a number of training recommendations here as well that intertwine with those best practice recommendations. So I want to turn this over to the board for any questions. Again, just wanting to re-emphasize, this is really the opportunity to strengthen some of those recommendations or add some additional recommendations for the disability section. So I'll go ahead and open this up to the board.
Thank you, Kendall. I'll open it up to board members who may have suggestions to strengthen the recommendations. I thought that this section also was really well thought out, and I appreciate the solid tethering to the ADA and to the best practices nationally. Are there any comments from the board members? Any suggestions for strengthening recommendations?
Hi, this is Melanie. I just have a few for this section. And again, I don't have the page numbers on the printed version, but it's on the same page that says comparison of use of force rates by disability group for community caretaking versus non-community caretaking stops. I don't know which page that is, but the second paragraph says health conditions or disabilities are not criminal matters, and as such, agencies should prioritize policies and practices that support alternative community-based responses. I think that should be directed to municipalities as well as agencies. They're the ones really that have the authority and the power to, create those alternatives and direct those things. So I think that should be just made clear there. There was another, I think, example, and I just the comment that I made with the last section, the hedging of the recommendations, and I don't know that I highlighted any specific examples in this, but just if you come across them as you're doing like the final edits, to just have like the board recommends that, not the board recommends that agency should think about maybe kind of blah. To just really be more explicit. If it's a thing that we're actually recommending, just say that we recommend it happening. And I think those were the main points of that, I think. Yeah, I think those were it. If I find one anymore, I might ping it at the end, but I think those were all the edits on this section. Thank you. Again, it was really strong, and I appreciate the work here.
I just want to take a moment to affirm Member Ochoa's point, which is, in many sections, that once something is a recommendation, the fact that it's in substance just a recommendation is already a weakening. And so to really use strong language, recommends, and then explicitly what the recommendation is, I think that's a great comment. And then also, I just wanted to say about this section in particular, and looking at the literature around policing and studies have been done, this is really, we want to be moving forward and in new ways and in ways that haven't been as much in the past in other states. And this section really represents that to me, to really look at disability and the interplay with law enforcement. So I just wanted to affirm that I think this is a really significant part of the report, not only for the recommendations, but even just the mere fact that we're moving forward with this analysis. So thank you.
Yes, and I think it's worth underscoring the dilemma that many community members with mental health conditions face because they don't have alternatives to calling law enforcement, right? And so that then leads to a series of interactions that end not well and tragically, right? And so it's stated, in various places and in the recommendations about the importance of decriminalizing mental health conditions, and I think that's just worth strengthening that language and maybe at the top, right before we go into the bullet pointed recommendations, how important these recommendations are given that dilemma. That would be my only addition. Any other comments from board members in this section?
One more from me, kind of piggybacking on what you just said, Andrea, is that it might be useful when you're talking about just like language adjustments at the outset, recognizing like there aren't alternatives and that agencies and legislators should take action to create them because of precisely the issue that was just raised. So like, let's make that clear. It's not so that we've done an explicit recommendation to an entity that's not just the police to voluntarily decide to do something different, but actually directing folks with the power and authority to create and fund additional alternatives.
That's right. That's right. All right. Well, let's move on to stops and searches. We did spend a lot of time in the last meeting on consent searches and supervision inquiries. And so I know that the DOJ has continuously been updating this report. And so I don't know if there's anything you want to highlight to us that is updated, or if there's anything you want to flag for us. I don't know that we need to spend as much time as we did in the last meeting on this. We certainly want to get through everything else. So on consent searches and supervision inquiries, is there anything else that DOJ would like us to think about?
So Kendall's computer went down. So she will hopefully be rejoining us shortly, but she is having to reboot everything. I mean, I can generally tell you all, what we tried to incorporate in the section was, adding in the data that had been rerun, and that had not been included before, and making more explicit some of the recommendations that the board had voted on. So those were the main changes, other than trying to, streamline the report and, bring out further tie-ins with the data and some of the recommendations. So, if you all like, Kendall can give you some additional highlights when she joins back in, but those were the main parts of the section.
Okay. All right.
May I ask a general question? And I apologize, as I'm new to the board, apologies if this is a wrong place to raise it. Melanie brought up a really important point around, the alternatives to policing, especially when it comes to individuals with mental health disabilities. What I think is lacking both in that context as well as with the consent searches is a culture in the United States and general understanding that people don't have to consent, right? I don't think there's an awareness of the lay public that they can say no, or that they're in a position to say no, number one. And number two, we even saw, I believe it was in Milwaukee last week, where, in a referendum, people in the community were asked to essentially vote on alternatives, and they unfortunately voted it down. Alternatives, unfortunately, in my opinion, alternatives to policing, I think because people don't know that there is an alternative. And I will tell you that in our work on hate incidents against Asian Americans and Pacific Islanders, we run into that very regularly, where individuals call the police when they get discriminated against at Walmart, because they don't know that there's civil rights enforcement, that there's civil rights laws. They only know because of 20 plus years of Law and Order on TV at every hour of the day that police are the only solution to any problem. And so even if we were to create or recommend alternatives, I don't know that people are given an understanding of what that means, and that there are other mechanisms in our legal structures to accommodate those and still protect individuals.
Thank you for raising that, Manju. I think that's a really important topic, and I think that's something that we should consider for 2022 conversations and maybe recommending to our board chairs that we carve out some time for that. I think this subcommittee meeting, we have limited amount of time, so this isn't a global conversation. This is a very specific conversation about this report, which is in its 11th hour. And we're just trying to provide the input that DOJ needs to finish it off. And so I will direct people to page 78, where the recommendations we made at the last meeting have been included on consent searches. So in that recommendation, which is in a box on page 78, it says that in light of the need for strong policy changes with impactful results, the board recommends the legislature pursue legislation that would severely limit and/or end the practice of consent searches. The board further recommends that law enforcement agencies or municipalities adopt policies or laws that limit or prohibit consent searches and require officers to conduct only evidence-based searches based on reasonable suspicion or probable cause. That's what we came up with. That's what was also before the full board in the last meeting. And then we also made another recommendation, which is also put into a box, and that's on page 95. And that is a recommendation regarding supervision inquiries. And there the board recommends that agencies, municipalities, and the legislature institute policies to prohibit or limit supervision inquiries. And it goes on to provide a little bit more detail about that. So just wanted to flag that those have been incorporated into the document, and grateful for DOJ to getting that in. If there are no other concerns, questions, or issues on consent searches or supervision inquiries, I would like us to move forward because
Andrea, sorry,
Yes.
may I make extremely quick comments? First of all, thank you for highlighting the two recommendations. In terms of next steps at the end, I'd like us to swing back to that to find out, besides being embedded in this report, if there are other actions we want to take for those. And then secondly, very quick, narrow comment for Kevin or anyone else who's back and listening. I noticed the word exponentially was used to describe two of the disparities in search rates in two places, and because exponential sometimes triggers people thinking about something mathematically a little differently, maybe saying far higher or at double the rate or something like that. I don't know, Kevin, if you can hear me, if that makes sense. It's a very narrow comment. Maybe.
Yeah, I don't think the research center included any.
Yeah, so just
somewhere in the review process, the word exponential.
Yeah, so we can swing back to another time. It's a little wordsmithy, but because it has to do with the impact of the report, I just wanted to flag. Might reword that. Okay, so Andrea, thank you for moving us forward.
And to board members or members of the public, if you do want to dig deep and wordsmith and be a copy editor on this, I'm sure DOJ would welcome you sending them directly that level of detail. But for our purposes, we should probably press forward.
I have some substantive comments that I want to make sure that we talk about. Particularly since we're talking about this recommendation, I don't think that it reflects at least what I understood on the supervision searches, particularly the line that says, agencies should require officers to run a records check to determine if someone is on supervision. Doing so will prevent racial and identity profiling because everyone will be treated equally. I definitely don't think our recommendation was that everyone should be subjected to searching background searches to find out if they're on supervision. And I think that would actually likely be illegal because you'd be extending stops beyond the time needed to actually complete the stops. And I definitely don't think the takeaway from the discussion about like engaging in these stops generally not turning over anything, etc., is that everyone should then be subjected to them for when there's like a legal basis. So I think I would just eliminate that sentence or those two sentences, and then at the end where it says like the policy changes can lead to big gains in community trust and respect that ultimately improve public safety and officers' time, while often also preventing unlawful profiling. I think it's also worth adding, and I think this is discussed in the prior discussions, like an unnecessary detention and harassments of individuals not even suspected of any crime, because I think that's fundamentally, the impact on the individuals is also something that we wanted to address. So I think I have some other comments, but I don't know if folks want to address that since that's in the call out suggestion.
Yeah, you're right, Melanie. We actually did not talk about those two sentences. That those didn't come from our conversation, and so.
Can I ask? Thank you for raising this. I hadn't read the records check as a now run everyone's record. I read it as instead of asking, but so yeah, can we discuss this now? Either removing those sentences altogether or.
Yeah, it was not part of the motion that had been made. So I think this was just some, just some context or additional language that DOJ had added to it. And DOJ, I don't know if you want to address this language, but given that this was a bit of a fraught discussion when we had it last time, I would recommend that we strike it since it hadn't been part of our conversation before.
And my apologies. Also get Kendall back on, but her internet just went out again. So I just want to clarify the recommendation that you were all talking about was on
page 95.
Okay.
And it's a call out box, and specifically the second sentence says, instead of asking individuals if they are on supervision, agencies should require officers to run a records check to determine if someone is on supervision. Doing so will prevent racial identity profiling because everyone will be treated equally. Those two sentences were not part of our recommendation from the last meeting. And
So
if we can strike those, that would be great. And Melanie made a suggestion for a wordsmith edit on the last sentence, and Melanie, perhaps you could email that to DOJ so that they have it. Okay. Melanie, did you have other substantive issues you wanted to raise?
I guess so. This is we're not talking about the pretext section yet, just the supervision and consent.
Yeah. Yep. And we're trying to move through this section that we already spent a lot of time on. So
yeah. I think that was it. I can just email the smaller changes.
Okay. All right. Great.
I will make a note of all of those. Thank you. I missed I got the second and third sentence. So Melanie,
Right.
we can discuss the last sentence.
Okay. Great. So I think Kendall is still coming back online. Is that right?
Hi, everyone. I'm back online. Of course, a year's worth of work and my internet crashes.
That's okay, Kendall. The good news is that we have moved through consent searches and supervision inquiries, and we are now ready for pretext stops.
Fantastic. And I don't know if someone's already directed folks to this, but the pretext stops is on pages 79 through 95 of the meeting packet. This section is meant to be more of an introduction into pretext stops. We're hoping next year and probably in the years to come, we'll really kind of dig into what could be pretextual stops and ways to eliminate or reduce those.
So can I pause you, because I think the pretext stop section actually begins in full on page 96 and runs through page 109, which includes it actually includes some language around a recommendation. I just want to make sure people are tracking correctly.
Yep,
Is that
for those who
right?
have this is the draft, Andrea, you have open the draft, specifically the draft section, so not the minutes and others. And
Right.
yeah, I
This
just wanted
is,
to say that out loud again. Page 96 is where I have that too. Thank you for
yes,
clarifying
that's
that.
right. Right. Yes. So, Kendall, is there specific information that you wanted to highlight for us? Because let me just preface by saying that that the data analysis that is provided here in the context that is laid, like the other sections before it, builds an argument for making a recommendation to eliminate pretext stops as other cities have done. And in fact, the language in here on page 109, the last sentence on that page says the board calls on policymakers and leaders to consider ways to eliminate pretextual stops and therefore reduce any potential for harm stemming from such stops. So I think the report goes further than what you were starting to lay out, Kendall, and I just wanted to flag that I think the language in here is good, it's strong, and I think that this is probably a direction that we may want to head in. And if other board members feel the same, I would invite a motion to that end to make that sentence a formal recommendation. But I don't want to cut you short, Kendall, before that invitation is answered. If it is answered, I want to make sure that you have an opportunity to highlight for us anything that you think is particularly moving in here and give board members an opportunity to help strengthen this document.
Certainly. So a few of the figures that we wanted to highlight were regarding traffic violations. Our traffic violations, hang on, my internet just decided to work. So there are traffic violations separated by moving and non-moving. It's a kind of a simple way to look at the differences in treatment just based on between moving and non-moving violations. The biggest discrepancies being seen by those perceived to be Asian being stopped I keep saying exponentially higher. I should not be saying that. They're being stopped at higher rates than those who are perceived to be Black. But conversely, those who are perceived to be Black are stopped for non-moving or equipment violations much more than any other perceived race or ethnicity. Amongst those, there are a few figures where we really started to kind of peel back the layers of what could be pretextual stops. One of those figures that we found particularly striking was the figure on obstructed window violations and the differences between those who are perceived as white and those who are perceived as Black or Hispanic. Similarly, we took a look at bike lights. That was something Board Member Kajabi had brought up. And we did see some fairly significant disparities there between, particularly for those who are perceived to be Hispanic and those who are perceived to be Black. Did want to highlight a few jurisdictions are making action on these right now. Those jurisdictions include the Berkeley Police Department. The Philadelphia Police Department recently passed a law prohibiting certain types of pretextual stops. Minneapolis similarly prohibits certain types of pretextual stops. And the state of Virginia also does for specifically tinted windows and the odor of marijuana. And so with that, I open it back up to the board for making further recommendations.
I appreciate that, Kendall, and just a reminder that we won't do any, if somebody does want to move anything now, we won't make any votes, take any votes until after public comment. But before turning it over to other board members, I also wanted to highlight page 108, the second paragraph, which I think is particularly compelling, and if you'll allow me, I would like to just read it. The consequences of pretextual stops can be severe. Nearly half of all the police killings in 2020 stemmed from nonviolent incidents, and over 10% of killings by police began with a traffic stop. In 2015, Sandra Bland lost her life after a pretextual stop. The police officer targeted her and pulled up so closely behind her that he essentially forced her to get out of his way, and she changed lanes without signaling. The officer then pulled her over for failing to signal. The next day, Sandra Bland was found deceased in her jail cell after allegedly dying of suicide. This past year, Dante Wright was shot and killed when a police officer admitted to firing her gun rather than her electronic control weapon, i.e. taser. Mr. Wright was pulled over for having expired vehicle registration tags and an air freshener hanging from the rear view mirror of the car. I think these are particularly potent examples, high-profile examples of why pretext stops can be so problematic. So I think that the content that you've provided in this report is strong and powerful and makes a good argument for a recommendation. I'd like to hear what other board members have to say about this section.
And jump in. I'm happy to call out that recommendation to end the pretext stops. However, we want to go ahead and move that forward. Couple questions and other just points. It was unclear to me if bike stops were included in traffic stops, because sometimes the language suggested that it was just cars, and other times you obviously do talk about bike-related stops. So just making that clear at the outset would be helpful to know whether that's included as a traffic stop category. When you're talking about the top 5 moving violation codes, it says the first graph says includes cell phone violations as one of the top 5 moving violations excluding CHP data, and then the next graph says has cell phone violation as one of the top 5 non-moving equipment violations for all agencies. So I don't know if these are different categories of violations. Some are moving, some are non-moving. If that's the case, you may need just to footnote which provisions are falling under each. Otherwise, it seems like it's double counting cell phone violations. On the graphs, the tables that have the top offenses for each ethnic group, they're a little bit hard to read for the lines. I would suggest either including at least grid lines for the rows or alternate shading for the different rows so that it's easier to see, to follow the text. And the discussion where you mention, I guess it's under data-driven solutions to identify pretext stops and their outcomes, and you discuss Wren v. US, and note that it's illegal under state law, legal under the Constitution to have these stops regardless of the actual motivation. I think the next line should be that it does violate state law, right? That's the whole purpose of RIPA, is that taking these actions being motivated by racial bias or identity bias is now illegal in California. So I think that's a very important part of that discussion that needs to be included there, so that the takeaway from anyone reading it is that there's nothing that can be done because it's perfectly fine. Like, it's actually explicitly illegal under state law. In the discussion for future reports, I would like actually to suggest that we have talk about bike stops more. There was a very recent article in the LA Times looking at LASD data, and that is kind of right as a basis for pretextual stops. There have been killings that stemmed from LASD over decades. That's not infrequent, unfortunately, that bike stops end in people being killed by LASD, and particularly with more agencies coming on board, I would love to see that data on bike stops for other folks doing a kind of deeper dive on that. The LA Times article might be one suggestion of how that could look. the next paragraph in that notes that the City of Philadelphia Police Department passed a law. I don't think the police department passed the law, so I'm just figuring that out. But in the next paragraph, it mentions the board calls on policymakers and leaders to consider ways to eliminate pretextual stops. I think that could make more explicit some of the ways that that is happening. So, for instance, DAs adopting policy that on not charging, if we could, that I think is a policy that's currently in place in San Francisco. And I think there may be even some other jurisdictions that have a similar policy. So I think providing examples of how that is actually coming to fruition, just including in there, would be helpful. Also, municipalities decriminalizing certain conduct through amending the municipal code or prohibiting stops on those bases. Those are actual policies that they could do. So I think having some of those things in there as examples of things that either are moving or we know would accomplish this outcome. And I don't know if that goes to your question, Andrea, about broadening the recommendation. So I don't know if you want to include that in that piece, or just listing them out in here in different ways that different leaders can actually impact this outside of just agencies changing their own policy.
Yeah, so given where we are in the year and on this report, I think that's content to include in the future report in terms of how to actualize that recommendation. But I think what is needed now is an actual recommendation to municipalities, agencies, and to the legislature to pursue policies that eliminate or limit pretextual stops. And as we discussed in the last meeting, like, we are not the ones that are writing the legislation, right? But we are making the recommendation. It is written here already, but we haven't ourselves explicitly moved that recommendation. So I think that's something that we should do to make it clear. It should be it's a call out box, just like the others were. I don't know. I welcome other comments from other board members on this section.
I would also support strengthening the visibility of the recommendation that's already embedded here in the report. And then also when we come to later in the meeting to talk about next steps, to swing back to some of these issues, for example, or at the bicycle stops and the types of specific violations and analysis we'll be able to do in the future, also because of the change in regulations that's coming with the way we're going to encode data.
Yes, and I put those things on the list for inclusion in the next report, which we can touch back on after public comment. So, any other suggestions for DOJ to strengthen this section, or any other comments or reflections? Just a reminder again that if you do have wordsmith level recommendations, I think those are probably best just delivered directly to DOJ via email. Okay, great. Okay, we will circle back on some of these things, but we have one more section to get through, and then we would like to open it up for public comment. And so the last section for us to take a look at is accountability, and DOJ, we welcome your help in highlighting the information that we should be looking at. And the accountability section starts on the draft at page 110, I believe.
That's correct. Thank you, Co-Chair Guerrero. I should introduce myself. My name's Anna Rick. I'm an Associate Program Analyst with the Civil Rights Enforcement Section. Our team has further developed this portion of the draft report since you last saw it. But the three key topics that the board decided to review this year have remained the same. The section includes 3 elements of accountability systems: auditing practices to enhance integrity of the STOP data, use of STOP data for policy change and staff supervision within agencies, and community-based accountability. One area that has been added since your last review, for instance, are the metrics that are identified in San Francisco's strategic plan. But in that first portion of the accountability system section, we've included examples of audits of STOP data conducted by the Los Angeles Police Commission Office of the Inspector General, the Oakland Police Department's Office of the Inspector General, and the Independent Monitor for the Oakland Police Department. 6 emerging practices and best practices recommendations are included on pages 114 through 116. In the section that begins on page 116, the board reviewed efforts in the Los Angeles, San Diego, and Oakland Police Departments, where agencies and their oversight bodies are using analysis of RIPA STOP data and body-worn camera footage data to identify how the agency's policies and practices lead to disparities in policing and develop targeted interventions. 6 potential best practice recommendations regarding using STOP data for policy change and staff supervision are found on pages 120 through 121. And in the final portion of this section, addresses community-based accountability. In that section, the board reviews several examples of community participation in oversight, advisory, and disciplinary boards. 2 potential recommendations in this area are included on page 128. And I'm very interested in your discussion about additional recommendations that the subcommittee would like to include in the report, discussion about the section content, and the subcommittee's vision for future work in this area.
Thank you, Anna. I think, just in terms of structure of the report, those last 2 recommendations came as bullet points, seemingly to follow the discussion of the various police departments. I think they need to be structured in a parallel fashion the way other recommendations are structured in the report. So it's not like an afterthought, but it's got a header. In fact, throughout the report, if there are recommendations that we're making, we need to make sure that they have their own header so it's clear to the public what those recommendations are. Let's open it up to the board members and see if they have suggestions for strengthening this section of the report.
I can go ahead first on this one too. Just, this is an issue that I've raised since last year's report about identifying DOJ's role in identifying inconsistencies in the data, particularly where we see at least inconsistency between reported data like CHP saying that they made an arrest, but they have never actually removed someone from the car or something like that, or things that we know either by definition have to follow. You're not arresting someone and keeping them in their car, right? And then things that most often follow, like a search was probably conducted before putting someone into the vehicle of into a police car, or they were handcuffed, or things like that. Maybe not 100% of the time, but almost certainly. Just pointing out those kind of discrepancies, and just kind of what, if any, role of the DOJ in this auditing process to identifying discrepancies. And that's something that I've raised for like a year, and even before even being on the board, and I still don't see any discussion of that. So I for sure, if there's not space to include it in this year, I really feel that it needs to be included in next year's, if we're talking about auditing and looking at inconsistencies. And I think it's one thing that I didn't see in the discussion of the LAPD OIG is, I believe in that report, it specifically, and I think I mentioned this also when I raised this report, was that there were trends in undercounting actions taken. So it was definitely, I think both Blacks and Latinx folks were more likely to have had actions taken that were not captured in the data that was reported to RIPA. So I think specifically noting the trend in lack of reporting should be included here when you're doing like a deep discussion on the LAPD OIG recommendations. So those are two things to say here. And then I have some smaller comments I can email.
Great, thank you, Melanie. Any other thoughts? All right, well, in the interest of time, why don't we open it up to the public? Amar, I'll turn it over to you.
Great, thank you so much. So now we'll take public comment. Obviously, the public's input is very valuable to all the work that we do here as a board. And I'd like to break it down by people who are listening in, whether you're in North Cal, Central California, or Southern California. And if you have any questions, if you could just kind of say your name in here and say where you're from, and we'll pick out folks starting from North Cal to California. So if you're in Northern California and you're on the chat, please say that you're from there, and then I'll call you out and take your comment.
Amar, it seems that we don't have anyone in Northern California, so if you want to move on.
Yeah. Anybody from Central California?
Yes, I'm from Central California.
Go ahead, sir.
Okay.
Please go ahead, sir.
I appreciate it. I've been looking through the report. I was kind of curious. I know that there was a discussion about consent and the issues with that. I'm kind of curious as to if it's the lowest percentage of interaction, why that this needs to be such a significant issue to attempt to eliminate. Usually when there are stops, the consent is recommended if you usually have something more anyways. And it's always best practice, even by law, to go ahead and ask for consent first. But it's usually the basis. So, but in totality of the report, it was very clear that it was a lower percentage of the contacts. So I was kind of curious about that.
I think that's a question that, Andrea, I don't know if we want to address now or just take a note of it for a future time.
Yeah, unfortunately, this is the period for public comment as opposed to board member comment or DOJ comment. So thank you, sir. And Amar, let's make sure everybody has an opportunity to speak.
Absolutely. Anybody else from Central California? Okay, going once, twice. Let's go to Southern California.
Yes, I would like to speak. I didn't know if there's like a raise the hand function, but can I just get right into it?
Please go ahead.
Okay, thank you. Well, my name is Erin Wilson Nieves. I'm Civic Engagement Manager with Alliance San Diego. organization working to ensure all residents can thrive in an environment of safety, harmony, justice, and equality. Now, racial profiling and racial biases are detrimental and damaging to any city's ability to create equitable treatment and respect for all community members. Several studies have now validated the countless experiences of Black, Brown, and Asian Pacific Islander people, which indicate the use of racial bias and profiling in policing. BIPOC communities should feel safe and respected, especially from the very people charged with protecting them, the police. Our community deserves our collective best efforts to prevent mistreatment, harassment, and abuse by our local law enforcement. You know, in today's climate, discontinuing pretext stops is a practical and necessary next step in the course of making that a reality now. And based on internal self-reporting documents, police departments here in San Diego County prove there's a different standard of policing for BIPOC communities. And that is really, really troubling for us. And we are working here locally to end pretext stops as a way of addressing this racial bias in policing. But a state policy could go a long way to raise the standard of policing and encourage equitable community treatment from all law enforcement agencies. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment. I see Tasha Williamson would like to speak. Please go ahead.
Hello, my name is Tasha Williamson. I'm a community advocate. Thank you for having me. Thank you all for volunteering to do this position as well. I'm a community advocate here in San Diego, the city of San Diego, and the county of San Diego. I hold police accountable every single day, every waking moment. Police officers, we have videotaped during pretext stops where they have intimidated passengers who were not a part of the nexus of the stop into getting out of the vehicle, being handcuffed. They have mistreated these people. They have a CPE report. They have also done a San Diego State University report that shows that they stop pretext stops and all other stops, Black people at a higher rate than any other race. We have officers that are on here now that will not tell you the truth. They have not been transparent in San Diego. They continue to not be transparent to boards and commissions, and they are reckless. It is corrupt. Pretext stops are not being just used for legal reasons. They are being used for corrupt and reckless reasons to be able to identify and place people in an FI status on a computer system, which is wrong. We have a right to be free. We have a right to walk around and go around our communities without being identified by police or anyone else when we are not committing a crime, when we are not subjects that are about to commit a crime with reasonable suspicion, not suspected. We have officers on here that do not know their jobs. They are harming our community members. We are asking you to stand because we have been asking for this to stop for decades. It is time that the next generation not have to live with the absolute corruption and disrespect that is happening to Black people and brown people, indigenous people and people of color, but happening to people who look like me every day in Southeast San Diego and other areas where economics is lower than most. They do not treat their white people like this. Stop them from treating mine. Thank you.
Thank you for your comment, Tasha. And I don't see anybody else commenting that they'd like to speak, but please, if you're in Southern California, type in the chat box or raise your hand or just say that you'd like to speak. We want to hear everybody's comments. One last time, going once, twice. Well, I think that's all the comments for today, so I'll get back to you, Andrea.
Thank you, Amar. Okay, so to my fellow board members, now it's time for us to wrap things up with our last item on the agenda, which is any voting or actions that we want to take. And so I have been keeping a running list, and I have 2 buckets, and tell me if these are the right buckets. I have one potential vote on pretext stops, and the vote would be on a recommendation if a motion is formally brought. That was the only potential vote that I have in that bucket. And then the other bucket that I have is items for inclusion for future reports. And they include, on the transgender section, include addressing the data for CHP that was in error. And Board Member Kajabi, maybe you can help articulate that better. I also have on this list continuing to track disparate application if AB 357 is not signed into law this year. We can assume that it won't be signed into law, I think, by the publication of this report. And the third item in the transgender section was to analyze intersectional data, to look at the transgender data or the gender data with race. And then for the stop section, for future reports, I have 3 items Board Member Choi, you intimated that you wanted to think more about consent searches and supervision inquiries, or what more to do with those recommendations. I think that was you. Forgive me if it wasn't. Also have consideration of bike stops as a deeper analysis, and then as a third item in the stop section to look at policies as examples of ways to eliminate pretext stops. And this, I think, is really getting at what municipalities and local government can do around that. And then in the accounting section, I had listed here for future reports to address auditing inconsistencies. And that was something that Board Member Choi, you raised that you'd like to see in the report. Are there other things that that we should consider in this section of our meeting? Yes, Board Member Kajabi.
Andrea, thank you for that fantastic summary of a lengthy list. I just want to swing back to when the bike stops were raised. So the LA Times recently shared analysis of LA Sheriff's Department stops and their pronounced racial and ethnic disparities. But one thing that comes out from that study was looking at specific violations. So in the context of bicycles, for example, some cities let you ride on sidewalks and some not. Some cities are well served with bike lanes, some not. And so by looking at a specific violation code, in that case, riding on the sidewalk, getting a better picture of what's going on. So when I heard the interest in our next steps, to me, it's not so much just looking at bicycle stops, but in particular, this idea that by looking at specific vehicle code or vehicle or bicycle, that is what violations have been recorded, getting a better understanding of what's exacerbating disparities in law enforcement practice. So I don't know, Board Member Cho, if that's a friendly amendment to not just looking at bicycle stops, but in particular in the spirit of the analysis the LA Times did. And because you've raised this issue many times in the past, that can we look at types of violations? And we saw a beginning of that in this report and looking at the, let's say, top 5 moving violations or top 5 vehicle code violations. So I think that's something we want to pursue further. So if I were to flag it in a list in just a nutshell, it's getting a sense for which types of violations are happening most frequently and where are they exacerbating disparities in policing.
I'm happy to add that. I think as the data comes in, or maybe as DOJ is poking around in the data, they may come up with additional analyses. What I really liked about the LA Times analysis was that it looked into basically the analysis that we did here for pretext stops, right? Like what makes it seem like this is not actually a public safety stop, it's about a pretext. And I think doing a deep dive in the bike data, the bike stop data will be very interesting on that and informative.
Okay, well, great.
Just as you, Andrea, when you were characterizing my suggestion on the differences on the municipalities, directions to municipalities and other entities to take action, I just wanted to specifically not do an analysis of what is happening, but just identify, because like in that section as examples that are things that are happening now, one of which being the policy that that San Francisco DA has adopted as something else that lawmakers can do. Just I think we talked about other things. We can do a deeper dive into things that have been successful or not, or like the evaluation of them in future report. But I think that was just to include that as an example, because I think the language is just not super useful. It just as leaders to consider ways to eliminate pretextual stops. So trying to get that.
Yeah. Okay, great. So let's we'll circle back to these future report items just one more time, but we do have on the table the possibility of a motion that would mirror the motions that were made in the report on consent searches and on supervision inquiries. And so there are best practice recommendations throughout the report, but these call out recommendations that we have been moving on, these are specifically recommendations to agencies, municipalities, and the legislature. And so it would be in that spirit that I would invite a motion to, like those others, for those bodies to pursue policies and legislation that limits or eliminates pretextual stops. So if other board members feel the same, then I would invite such a motion worded as you see fit.
I haven't thought through specific wording, but I'd like to, propose that we now work on the wording for a recommendation that would then be boxed off in parallel to the others, as Board Member Guerrero suggested. Does anyone else want to start us with a wording recommendation? Or Board Member Guerrero, did you have?
Yeah, and we don't have to wordsmith the recommendation itself. I think we just need to make a motion to recommend, and my suggestion would be, a motion that recommends to agencies, municipalities, and the legislature that they pursue policies and legislative changes that would limit or eliminate pretextual stops.
You did it. I like that wording. So I would like to, was that your motion? I'd like to second, or I'd like to move that we adopt the proposal that Board Member Guerrero just made.
All right. I like your motion, Board Member Kajabi. Is there a second?
I second.
All right. Board Member Kulkarni seconds it. So we have a motion on the table for a vote. And if we could get a verbal vote. Board Member Ochoa?
Aye.
Board Member Kampa-Najjar?
I vote yes.
Great. And I vote yes. So the motion carries. And that is a recommendation for DOJ to include in the report, pulled out like the others. All right, so we're in our final stretch here with the future report direction that we're giving to DOJ, and let's take these in. We'll take these in three parts: the transgender policy analysis, the stops, and then the accountability. So for transgender, what I had collected from our conversation was that we would like to, and Board Member Kajabi, maybe you can help us think about how to frame this, but we would like to look into the data from the CHP error
Yeah, can I say I heard 3 items? One is to make sure that for next year that the data collection addresses that this error isn't replicated. It sounds like that's already being done. The second is that if there is a pool of the 1,000 stops that were affected, that we can look at those to see if there are data trends of interest. And in particular, third, because of what was raised, looking at intersectionality and to throw out to have that 1,000 stops missing from our current data set hampers doing deeper dive into trans community. And so if we are able to isolate those 1,000 stops, to look at them also within IDA intersectionality for those 3 strands.
Great, thank you.
And I remember Kulkarni, if you feel like that captures in a nutshell. But okay, thanks.
I do.
Okay. Right. Was there anything else that we wanted? Those were the 3 things we identified in our conversation. Anything else that we wanted the DOJ to include? Okay. Right. Then moving on to the stops section. The 3 things that we had was, and again, I invite your assistance, and in particular, I invite Board Member Ochoa's assistance. What more to do with RECs on consent searches and supervision inquiries, looking at specific violations to understand the disparities in bike stops, and identifying policy examples to help local government eliminate pretext stops.
I don't remember that being my recommendation, or maybe one of my substantive suggestions.
I was typing very fast, so if that wasn't yours, we can strike it. So then we have one on bike stops. I think Board Member Kajabi already articulated that well, looking at specific violations to understand the disparities in bike stops.
Can I add a footnote? Because by seeing disparities, I mean, our goal is to move to policy recommendations that will eliminate them. So I just want to emphasize looking at type of violations with an IDA policy recommendation.
Okay.
Potential policy recommendation.
Right, and then on this first one that we mentioned, I don't know if this rises to the level of a focus for future reports, but I put it in this section. So if anyone remembers making this comment or thinks it should be elucidated, what more to do with RECs on consent searches and supervision inquiries?
I think it might have been my comment about sort of the future reports and looking at cultural bases for attitudes on consent searches and whether they were truly consensual. I'm guessing that was it, though I'm not positive.
All right, we'll go with that.
I'm sorry, one thing to that recommendation, and we're rushing, so I forgot about raising this again, but what I remember you also mentioning was that the alternatives, that people weren't aware of alternatives, right? And I think if I remember serves me correctly, there is actually a substantive part of this larger report that does go in more detail about the alternatives. So I wonder whether it would serve your purposes, Manju, if we made more explicit that. I think we say like alternatives as discussed later in the report, but maybe just specifically spelling out in a sentence or two, like some of those things in the context of where we're talking about them for the disability section. That might be useful to give like a flavor of the larger discussion that comes later, that addresses kind of the public education piece of the alternative discussion.
Yeah, I would support that.
Okay. Okay. All right. So we'll leave it to DOJ to incorporate those into the narrative around focuses for future reports, vision for future reports in the different sections, wherever that's relevant. Great. I think that brings us to the end. Are there any other comments that you want to make? Any closing comments, I should say. Closing comments.
Yeah, just one last question that I had that I didn't notice. It was unclear to me on when we're discussing the policies whether the very first sentence or paragraph specifically identifies the actual definition of racial bias under the law, and there's different I guess categories which each of the policies are evaluated to determine whether or not they're satisfied, but it's unclear to me if any of those actually corresponds with the policy being accurate with respect to those things. It's like, is it clear? Is it standalone? But it does, I don't know if accuracy is actually included in that, and if that is kind of subsumed in one of those things that are being tested, to explicitly say that one of those things actually captures, one of those check boxes captures whether or not it's accurate, or if not, if that's something that can still be added at this point, just to say whether the definition reflects state law, not just that it's clear.
And you're referring to the agency policy review section? Yeah. Okay.
I can speak to that for a second. The matrix was really based on them having any definition at all, and so sometimes it is the definition of the penal code, but sometimes it's a definition of implicit bias or explicit bias or racial identity profiling. So the matrix, as it stands now, is whether they have any definitions at all that are consistent with either the penal code or, what would be, a commonly used definition of implicit bias, for example. So they were not looking at necessarily whether the definition matched the definition in the penal code, but more that there was a definition or explanation in the first place, because before starting this, most agencies' policies, many of them did not have any definitions of any, of any of these types of topics. So for now, it was not focused on accuracy. It was more generally this idea of that they contain definitions consistent with the penal code, but also with other definitions that may be in the literature. And so I think at this point, it would be difficult to make that adjustment when we're looking at this next year, because we won't do a matrix because it will be 400 plus agencies. So it will have to be a discussion with the subcommittee about how we want to adjust it going forward. Then I think, that can be a part of the discussion then. But it would be challenging to sort of alter what the process has been up until this point, which is really looking at, do they have any definitions?
So thank you for that, and I agree, we definitely can't be doing this for every agency. And I'll leave it to you guys to determine whether or not there's so many agencies that we couldn't just add another category and do that just to see if that definition, so not change what is already here, but just add is it accurate? Because I think that has ramifications in particular in terms of policy violations, right? Like if they're violating policy, it matters if the policy is actually conforms with state law, or if it's just some other definition that exists in the ether that they've used that may have been okay before state law existed, but but again, you would know the amount of time it would take to actually do that. So I'm not saying let's put it in here if you feel like it's going to take too much time.
I think, this is Nancy, I think the other issue is that in doing that, Melanie, it would essentially be doing a legal analysis of the policy, and that is not something that would be appropriate for DOJ to do. And I don't actually think doing legal analyses whether or not doing that kind of evaluation is really kind of within the purview of the board's functions either. So I think we have to be very careful about that particular, like whether or not it meets the legal definitions and doing kind of a legal conclusion like that.
I do think one thing that has been an issue with agencies is that they don't consider all of the, I mean, we saw kind of in the chat this discussion about pretext stops. It's like if there's a basis for it, then you can do it. It doesn't matter. Nothing else matters. And I think that's how agencies are operating, and I think that's how a lot of the policies allow for that. And I think the explicit calling out and identifying that if it's any factor at all in any action taken, not just the sole basis for the stop, that's a tremendous difference in how agencies conceive of bias policing. And at least having that element, I think that's a necessary element of the state law definition, and that may not be present in all of the other definitions. So at least if you don't want to say it conforms with state law, then at least saying it captures these elements, it has these elements in it, even if it's not all of the specific requirements.
Okay, I see Board Member Kajabi had her, nope. Okay. Board Member Ochoa, did you have other things that you wanted to raise in these as closing? Board Member Kulkarni, anything you want to add as closing comment? No. Board Member and Co-Chair Amar Rampanajar, anything you want to add or say?
No.
Okay. All right. Great. Well, I believe this is our last subcommittee meeting of the year. The next meeting that we have will be in full with the full board to sign off on the final report that will be published January 1st. Just a reminder that the data comes in April 1st every year. So we will be turning right back into what we want to focus on and analyze in the data that is incoming in 2022. It'll be an opportunity for us to continue to build on the reports that we've been publishing for the last couple of years. We've been bringing on agencies in waves, and we're coming into full application of RIPA in the state of California. And I think, it's been a few years of getting everything off the ground, of defining terms, developing regulations, refining regulations, and doing the analysis. I think looking forward, we have a real opportunity to go deeper than the data and really start to think about the other parts of our function, which is to do a lot more of the deep thinking after analysis, right? So once we now analyze the data, then what do we do that? We will have actionable data. How are we going to use that in the coming year? So those just are things to keep in mind. Hopefully all of the board members that are here today will continue through into 2022 for consistency. That would be great. And that's it. DOJ, I think we're done. Is that it? Is that right?
Yes, thank you. There is a Stop Data Subcommittee meeting tomorrow for folks interested in attending. That will be at 11 a.m. And then the next full board meeting will be on December 1st. So we really appreciate everyone's participation. A revised draft of the report will go out to the board and get posted ahead of that meeting. And subcommittee members for Stop Data should have already received those materials. So we look forward to seeing some of you then. But thank you everyone for your participation. And again, as Andrea said, if any of you have wordsmithing or notice errors, or there are things, there are edits you have, please feel free to send them. You can send them to me or to Anna.
Great.
We will work on incorporating them.
Great. So thank you to the DOJ staff. I know you've been working really hard on this, and hopefully you can see the light at the end of the tunnel. It's really tremendous work. To the members of the public, thank you so much for participating today and for sticking with us. This is really, really important stuff, and this is how we get to a new day where there is no racial identity profiling and everybody feels safe. So thank you so much. Have a good day. We will give you back the 10 minutes of your day. Be well.
Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.